Welcome to the webinar on Rapid Risk Assessment Tools for Animal Disease Outbreaks, which is organized by EFSA. Three different rapid risk assessment tools will be presented, and I will be the one presenting the first tool, which is risk assessment for vector-borne diseases. The tool is called MintRisk. My name is Aline de Koeijer and I work at Wageningen Bioveterinary Research, which was formerly called the CVI. The purpose of MintRisk is, as I said, risk assessment of vector-borne exotic livestock diseases, and it's mainly meant for quick scan risk assessment, but it can also be used for slightly more in-depth assessment of the risks. One of the typical purposes is also to compare different infections, so that's one of the main things, that every different disease is assessed in the same way so that we can compare all those diseases. Besides that, risk pathways and risk source areas and at-risk areas can be compared for the risk. Besides that, it's also helpful to support the budgeting for prevention and preparedness. 5 years ago, a risk assessment framework was developed for emerging vector-borne livestock diseases in the Netherlands, and it was developed into a structure, as you can see on the slide on the right-hand side, as a structure with 6 building blocks, from which we end up with a final risk estimate. The first 3 blocks together bring the introduction of the infection, so the risk of introduction in the area, whereas the second 3 blocks deal with the spread of the infection and the impact of an infection. The tool we developed is a web tool, and you see here the link to the web address. It works with a list of questions, and for each risk assessment block, several questions need to be addressed. Qualitative answers need to be given, but there's always an underlying explanation for these qualitative terms in a quantitative version. That means that we can also use real mathematical algorithms to evaluate the results, and always in the end we translate the quantitative solutions back into qualitative terms for ease of communication. A special version of MintRisk is developed for EFSA because EFSA wanted to do a risk assessment of 39 different vector-borne diseases, and they wanted a risk assessment from the full length of introduction of the infection, and including also how big is the epidemic going to be if the infection gets in, and what is the impact going to be. The EFSA version of MintRisk is mainly the same, but several questions have been skipped, a few answer categories have been changed specially for their version of the model, and the impact is reduced substantially. And with impact, I mean the number of questions regarding impact. I have a few references here listed, but I will now switch to the model directly, and I will guide you through the model to show you how this works. If you enter the login address in your browser, you end up with it at the section where it says home. You get some basic information. You can log in there. You can ask for a guest account. You can tick the box guest at that page. I'm not going to do that now because then I need to log in again. Oh, I will have to log in anyway, so I will show you how that works. You can either tick this box and say I'm a guest, or you create a new login by pressing the button register. I have done that already before, so I will log in now. And we enter this way into the real analysis web tool. There are several blocks here. The first 3 question blocks are given under point 3, and the second set of 3 question blocks are given under point 5, and the rest are in between. So first you need to define what you want to work on, and I want to give you the example of blue tongue introduction in, for example, the north of Europe. That means that the north of Europe is a specific set of countries that we look at. It's not a zoonotic disease, so I don't need to tick this. So I can go on to the risk pathways. Normally, if you do a new risk assessment, of course, you have to fill in all this information. But what we have here is the example of the database created by EFSA. So all the data is already available there. And if you want to evaluate what has been done, you can use this, or you can extend on these risk assessments and building your own analysis on top of it. So I want to give the example here with a pathway that has been created for import of breeding animals of different species from outside the EU, which is this, this pathway, and I will ignore the other two pathways for the time being. So I will go on to the pathway questions. I select my pathway that I want to work on, and then I have 4 different risk aspects for which questions need to be answered. So I'm going to give the example here of the risk of entry. 3 questions need to be addressed, and a lot of these are obviously about how many animals move from one country to the other, and what about prevention measures, that sort of questions. The answering categories here are always minimal, minor, moderate, major, massive, or very low, low, moderate, high, very high. That sort of answering categories are explained under the button I, where the different values of animals imported are given as on a logarithmic scale. All answers that are used in this analysis are usually on a logarithmic scale. So anything that is much smaller than the 100 animals here, for example, is still called minimal, but it might be, it is still an endless scale that keeps going on. So we remove the information here. The choice minimal has been made in the past, so we see, well, these results, we want to see what that does. So we push the button calculate, and no surprise, we get the same answer as before because I haven't changed anything. You can do this for all the 4 different question blocks, and if you do that all together, you will end up in a summary of all the different pathways and the results they have, and in this case only the pathway I selected is evaluated, and the overall risk is very, very low because it's negative. In this case I want to continue only with this pathway, and the other 2 I haven't looked at, so I do not want to address these, so I save the selection that only the import from beyond the EU will be addressed. So then I can continue to questions from what happens after introduction. When I do that, I get an overview of the results from the risk assessment of all the different building blocks that together create the risk of introduction. And the most essential one here in this case is the very low rate of entry risk, which leads to an overall low risk. When you continue from that, there are 5 building blocks that tell you how to deal with the spread of the infection and the impact of the infection. The first one of that is about the annual extent of spread. I will show you how that works. Once you say I want to look into the risk of annual extent of spread, you get again a list of questions for each of these questions. Again, you need to create answers in the same way as it was done before. Usually there are 5 typical categories. Sometimes we have the category unknown added, sometimes we have a hard 0 added as a risk, and sometimes you can also add your own value. I'm going to show you how that works. If you want to do that, you can type here a real value instead of using the category here. So if you would do that, you could choose some value that, for example, I think, well, this number is going to be 3, and instead of moderate, I know exactly what the answer is, so therefore I type here a 3 instead of the moderate that had been chosen before. So I continue the analysis, I say calculate and save. I get a different answer now because the choice is different than it was before. So my assessment for this example leads to a higher risk than the original assessment as done by EFSA. Again, this can be done for each of these different building blocks, and the underlying calculations bring together the whole analysis. So if you do that, for each of these blocks, you find out that when you look into the results, you get for each of the different blocks, you get results, and you get summary results for all those blocks. So the overall rate of introduction was very low, which is the results from a very low rate of entry. Then we have a high extent of spread, which is because I increased the level of transmission in this example. But the overwintering is moderate, and an overall size of the epidemic would still be very high. Given the infection that we're looking at and the size of the epidemic, that means production losses can be high. Since it's not a zoonotic disease, of course, public health will remain very low. And since a lot of animals get diseased, in this example, you would also find that the animal welfare problem is very high. This is quite different from the assessment that EFSA has done, because I changed the value for the transmission, leading to a moderate to high estimate instead of their low risk assessment for this example. Now, if you look with your mouse button on the eyes, which are given in all the answer categories, you see that real values are given here to indicate what sort of risk actually, what sort of value underlies the risk. These are risk scores which are relative terms and can be translated in actual issues like probabilities or numbers of infected animals. But in this case, we have not run the simulation yet. We have just done the deterministic calculation with the average value chosen for each category. So if we want to run a full calculation, we, for example, do 10 runs, not because we do not want to wait too long. You can give a seed so that you can repeat exactly the same simulation if you want to, or you give another number, whichever you want. And then you can calculate this. It takes a while to calculate, and it doesn't seem to want to calculate. So what it's supposed to do now is give an answer for the simulated version, but for some reason it doesn't work. Yeah, now it's calculating in Italian. So we have the answers now, and we see that, well, the overall rate of introduction is very low. It's below 0, which is extremely low, and there is an uncertainty in that also from 0.49 to 0.13, both below 0. So now we have the simulated version, so you have a bit of the feeling of how certain or uncertain we also are about this number. Well, in the end, you can also export, of course, the results of this work. And for everyone who wants to work on this, it's free to work with the EFSA version of the model. You can have access to all the numbers that were imported and introduced by EFSA for this specific opinion that they created. What is also possible is to work with the original version, but then you will have to contact us under the button Contact and see whether we can help you with creating maybe your own version or working with a more complete version of MintRisk. But everyone is always free to work with the EFSA version. So that's all I wanted to tell you about the MintRisk model, and the webinar will continue in 2 minutes' time with a presentation by Cecilia Hult.
Hello everybody, my name is Cecilia Hult and I work at the National Veterinary Institute in Sweden. Some years ago we developed a qualitative rapid risk assessment tool, which is really a systematic qualitative way of working with this kind of assessments. The assessments that are produced with this tool are always sent to the Board of Agriculture, who is our risk manager, and also to the Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation. And we also publish our reports on the web page of our institute. And so far we have mostly used this tool for African swine fever and avian influenza. So why did we want to develop this rapid risk assessment tool? There was a need to communicate these type of assessments to our manager, and we wanted to develop the tool to get a systematic way to assess the risk of introduction of exotic pathogens to the Swedish animal population. We did that kind of assessments also before the tool, but they were more in the form of short statements. And the pros, from our point of view, with this tool is that it's structured and systematic, and it's more well documented than before, and because of that, it's also more transparent. And the reason that we went for a qualitative approach was that Sweden has a small animal population and also a minimal live animal trade, which can be counted in hundreds, a couple of hundreds of pigs per year, and even less amount of cattle. And therefore there's a lack of quantitative data to use for these kind of assessments. We also expected low probabilities of introduction in most cases, and this combination of scarce data and possible low probabilities and large uncertainties made us choose a qualitative approach. So risk in risk assessment is really a probability and consequences, but as we in these assessments mostly deal with pathogens that are exotic to Sweden and that are managed within the Act of Epizootic Disease, the consequences are kind of built in. So we ended up deciding that this tool would express only the probability of introduction and not the risk. And in the probability of introduction, we include both the probability of entry, the pathogen crossing the border, and then also the probability of exposure of Swedish animals. And the reason for that is mainly that in most cases the most relevant pathways for Sweden are indirect pathways, and therefore we assume that we have introductions or entries that are never exposed to animals and therefore never giving rise to an outbreak. And therefore we thought that including exposure in the probability of introduction would give a more accurate estimation of the probability. So this small model consists of three parts. It's one instruction, a disease-specific template, and a report. And it's only the report that we will publish, and that's used externally. So in this instruction, we deal with for example, with the criteria for when a rapid risk assessment should be considered. And we have chosen 4 different criteria: an episodic outbreak in Europe, or a large zoonotic outbreak in Europe. It could also be a new or emerging disease in Europe, or some other extraordinary event, like a natural disaster, for example, that could cause spread of disease. And we do some horizon scanning to judge these criteria, and we use there, for example, the mails from the Commission, the ADNS reports, OIE reports, and also some other sources like ProMed, for example. And when we have decided to do an assessment, we just follow the identified risk pathways for the disease that we are assessing, and do a qualitative assessment for each step of those pathways. And to get a final probability for each pathway, we'd use a combination matrix to merge the probability of entry with the probability of exposure. For each pathway, we also grade the quality of the data used. And finally, we pick the pathway with the highest probability and use that for the communication of probability for the assessment. So, probability terminology. For this, we use a 6-category scale from negligible to very high. And we try always to also give the interpretation when we use these terms. So it will be easier for the manager to understand what we mean with these different terms. A little bit the same with uncertainty. We use a scale with 3 categories. Low uncertainty means that we have solid and complete data or good trade statistics or whatever. And high uncertainty, we have to rely on unpublished observations or personal communications, for example. And this is a table of this combination matrix that I was talking about. And the way to use it is just that you take the probability assessment from the first step and the probability assessment from the second step and look in the table where you end up. So, getting back to the template, it consists of a description of the disease, a risk pathway for this disease, and a table for documentation of the probability questions that's connected with the risk pathways. So this is an example of risk pathways for African swine fever. And since it's in Swedish, I have translated for you. At the left side, you have the risk pathways crossing the border. And this, for example, for this disease, live pigs, semen, eggs, and embryos, fomites, animal products, food waste, or wild boars. And on the right side, we have the possible pathways within the country to domestic pigs with high biosecurity, domestic pigs with low biosecurity, wild boar free-ranging, and wild boar fenced. These different pathways go into the table, and in this table you have the risk question in one column, and then the next column is what parameters to include in the assessment, and the next column is the data from these different parameters, and then your assessment and the uncertainty. So, for example, this table is for avian influenza, and the first question is, what's the probability of infected live poultry crossing the Swedish border? And to answer that question, we would consider, for example, mitigating measures in the outbreak region, if this region is a trade partner, and if we traded, when did we do it? And if we traded also, what were the trade volumes? And after that, we do our assessment. And the reports that we produce from the assessment is, as I said earlier, always sent to the Board of Agriculture and the Ministry of Innovation and Enterprise, and also published and commented on our website. And we try to keep it short and it looks like this and includes a background, what happened, what was the event that triggered this assessment, and a short version of the assessment and the conclusion together with the interpretation. And we also most of the time include a map to show where the outbreak took place. And this is the assessment when African swine fever spread to Czechia. And finally, some of the challenges with this work and this tool is, of course, that you have to have the resources to use it when something happens. You have to be able to communicate the level of probability, because it's not always the thing that people understand what you mean by low, even if you give an interpretation. And that's why we always publish our assessments together with a comment. What does this mean for Sweden? And validity over time can also be an issue. In our case, we do these assessments following specified events, and the validity is then more or less until the next time we do an assessment for the same disease. So thank you very much for your attention, and the next presentation will be given by Helen Roberts from the UK, and it will start in approximately 2 minutes. So please stay connected.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third presentation in these series of rapid risk assessment tools for the EFSA webinar. My name is Dr. Helen Roberts, and I work at the Animal Plant Health Agency in the UK, where I'm responsible for international disease monitoring and risk assessment for DEFRA. And today I'm going to talk about our risk of incursion tool. So I'm going to go through why the tool was needed in the first place since its development in 2009, the main questions that it answers, what sort of elements of risk assessment does it cover, who it was aimed at, what type of inputs and outputs we have, how we look at uncertainty within the tool itself, and any possible further work. So the reason we developed the tool in the first place was to support another system we have called the D2R2, which is a disease risk and prioritization ranking tool. It's not R2D2. And for this tool, we look at both endemic and exotic diseases in the UK and give them a priority according to one of the reasons for government intervention. And part of that whole process is also to consider the risk of introduction of disease. Originally, we did this by using expert elicitation, but that's difficult to do on a constant basis. Your experts change. It's a very subjective system. So I was asked to provide some sort of tool we could use that would be a bit more systematic in its approach towards this. And since then, we use the tool both for this to feed into D2R2, but also to inform our exotics disease control team about where they would want to prioritise certain disease control measures, and also for our imports team to look at any risk arising through imports. The tool itself uses the OIE risk assessment framework. It uses pathways for the entry of disease up to the border. We're not as concerned about national rules, so we're only really assessing up to the border itself. And we also consider the likelihood of that disease getting into the first animal by weighting those pathways. And as we go through, you'll see what I mean by that. But it's very important that not all pathways are given a similar weighting because they will be quite different. The exposure or spread assessment is covered by the D2R2 tool itself. So once that score is made for the risk of introduction, then there are further questions which are asked to look at the risk of exposure in terms of the livestock population and presence of vectors and so on. The IDM tool uses trade data, so Comtrade or traces data for various consignments and commodities. It also uses disease data from the OIE and the EU ADNS system. And we use the disease characteristics that are available in scientific literature, but also very much using the OIE fact sheets as well. And finally, we look at the different trade rules that are in place in the EU and also the OIE recommendations for safe trade in different commodities. The tool itself uses a simple Microsoft Excel workbook. Within it links different spreadsheets together to give a final risk score. It's a semi-quantitative tool and is used really to compare from one disease to another. If you wanted to look at a single disease, you have to do some more in-depth analysis of that particular disease. The first version was published in the Vet Record in 2011, and we've since then been developing the tool a little bit more, so it has got some new features which we'll hope to publish on again quite soon. So the issues that are covered by the tool are looking at trade partners, and we do this by region rather than by individual country. That's because every country tends to have a similar pattern of who we trade with. It's a very familiar way for a lot of farmers that they will always trade with the same partners. We don't tend to trade much outside a geographic region because then you can end up with animals that are not suited to your environment. So it does ignore country boundaries and therefore can be used to look at transboundary animal diseases. As I said before, we use trade pathways and we prioritise those pathways by weighting them in a specific way. And very importantly, we look at trade volumes. Now, rather than going through all of the different consignment numbers by week or month, we go annually and we give a semi-quantitative score to those levels of trade. So, for example, if you have up to 100 consignments of animals, then that's scoring just a 1. If it's from 100 up to 1,000, it scores a 2. And then anything over 1,000 consignments, it scores a 3. We also look at other non-trade pathways or non-trade partners, and that's to give us a score for the approximate illegal level of a pathway. It's very difficult to always look at illegal movements of things because that's the whole point about being illegal, is we don't find out about them. But we need to have some sort of background risk to cover that possibility. And then there's a spreadsheet that covers the mitigation, so it allows us to have a negative score where there are EU rules in place, for example, over trade rules, or if vaccination or control program is in place in the country of origin where the disease is happening. Importantly, it's quick to use and very easy to update. So those were two of the things that we've had to make sure that we were happy with, that it wasn't going to be a large IT function to use this as well. We cover the exotic notifiable diseases and then new and emerging diseases, zoonotic and non-zoonotic, but we're not looking at the public health risk or the likelihood of it getting into the public. We also look at wildlife and livestock, so we're not just limiting ourselves to livestock diseases. Pets and horses, which do trade around the world in quite different ways. Balai animals, which balai is the term for approved premises and the movement of animals between approved premises such as zoos or laboratories. So we're looking at elephants, giraffes, antelopes or anything like that. We must be able to add diseases into it quite easily. So not just because there could be a new emerging disease happening, but because we've realised that we haven't prioritised a particular disease and we need to look into that and how easily that would become established in the UK. We also look at changes in legislation for trade partners. The EU will put in place safeguard measures when diseases are reported, so we need to understand what those measures are and how that can change. This is just a diagram of the process itself. It shows you the different sorts of spreadsheets we have in the black writing in those boxes there. It asks a series of questions in each of those spreadsheets. So which country is a disease present in? Do we, the UK, trade with that particular country? If you don't, then we'd expect it to be a negligible risk. If we trade with the country, is it a commodity that is a high or medium risk commodity? Do we trade in high levels of that commodity? Then we have the questions around mitigating actions. And we also have questions about other risk pathways, particularly wild bird migration routes, and the illegal movements, as we mentioned before. And that is all tallied up through a particular algorithm to give you a final risk score. So when you come to use the tool, the most important thing to do is to get hold of your trade data. Look for the most high risk, medium risk products. We're not particularly worried about the low risk products because I'm sure many of you are aware there are a huge number of different things that we do trade in, but not all of them could be considered a risk. We work out the trade patterns by the region rather than by country, so we can ignore political boundaries. And for each disease, work out the highest risk pathways as well. So, for example, a live animal coming into the country is always going to be higher risk than meat products because that live animal will be going to meet other live animals. And then there's a basic algorithm in which each pathway is multiplied up by the trade volumes and given an additive score, and then there's a negative score for the pathways according to the mitigation. So here's an example, a snapshot of what the tool itself looks like. You can see here all the different regions lined up on the left, and then along the top are the different diseases that we've so far got in the tool. And we've given a score to each of those diseases in those regions. 0.5 suggests that disease may be present in wild animals or backyard or small holding premises, but very rarely getting into the big commercial premises, whereas a score of 1 suggests that disease is regularly in commercial premises. We sometimes have given a score of 2 when it is very widely seen in commercial premises. That's an exception. It doesn't happen very often because clearly that is a big worry when it does happen, but at least the facility is there to do it. Then in terms of the pathways, for this we have picked the highest risk pathways rather than some of the more obscure ones that I'm sure every risk assessor knows that you can always find a pathway for something. We've got the main ones being the trade in livestock, meat or other products such as skins and hides and so on, germinal products, the import of laboratory material, transport, which is to cover fomite risk, horses, food waste, so international catering waste, bird migration score, vectors, illegal imports and zoo animals. And again, for these, we've weighted some of the pathways because some of them, they're more likely to have, to actually reach the animals themselves, or it's a pathway that we don't understand much about. So to be risk averse, it gets quite a high score, such as the illegal imports. Then we look at trade volumes, and for this, as I said, we do an annual breakdown of the trade in all the different commodities or numbers of live animals and give it a semi-quantitative score of 0 to 3. We just have the 4 categories there. We don't go any higher than that because once you've got over 1,000 or so consignments every year, that's usually quite a large number. And for the avian diseases, instead of having germinal products, we've got eggs. So day-old chicks and hatching eggs are included in that score. Mitigation measures could include, as I said, vaccination programs, or disease control programs using stamping out. There may be other safety measures that have been put in place, or movement restrictions, culling and surveillance, and so on. A score of yes means that that country where the disease is present is doing those different control measures. If it gets a no, then we think it's not being put in place, maybe because the disease is in wildlife. And if it gets a P, it's about potentially it being put in place. So, for example, the environmental conditions in the EU is about whether a vector could become established in the UK. So for some of those diseases, if we take African swine fever, for example, the soft tick can carry the disease, but we don't have any of them, as far as we know, in the UK. So it's probably not going to be an important route for transmission. And you end up with a final comparison table, which you can see here. And these will change according to the season, so we can change the level for the bird migration, we can change the risk level associated with the vectors. It can also change on an ad hoc basis as well. So if a country suddenly reports disease, we can go into the tool and change it. We keep, every 6 months, we'll keep a snapshot of the tool to see how things have changed and moved around a bit. But generally speaking, doesn't have to be changed that much, because there aren't that many unusual outbreaks that are occurring that would make us think the risk may have gone up. But we do use this tool to sometimes explain to policymakers why a disease is at a particular risk level or not. We've also done some sensitivity analysis around one of our favourite diseases, African swine fever, something that we're all quite concerned about, but just to see, again, when we think the disease risk to the UK would go up significantly if the disease continues to spread throughout Europe. And we've worked out, using this tool, that if you put the disease risk up to 2, so meaning that disease was present widely in the commercial pig sector in Eastern Europe, and if we increased our trade level from Eastern Europe to 3, then our risk level would go up considerably. But it still wouldn't be high, because you'd still expect trade mitigation measures to be in place. If disease got into Western Europe, then you would have an increase because of the fomite risk through transport. So trucks and things coming over to the UK, they haven't got as far to travel, so there's potential for fomite transfer. And there, again, you've got an increase up to a medium risk, even if it's just in wild boar, the odd backyard pigs. But it goes up to high if we increase that risk up to a 2, so it's freely circulating in the commercial pig sector. So that just gives you an idea of how much it can move around and why we would use this tool in a particular way. In terms of the pros and cons of the disease itself, of the tool itself rather, then I was trying to put these down and decided that actually no detail, that it's quite a simple tool, is both an advantage and a disadvantage, maybe, and it does depend on who's using it, what you're using it for. If you are going to use it to look at individual diseases, it does need to be sense checked. You want to have somebody else going into the tool, having a look at those pathways, making sure they make sense, and don't take that score for a single disease on its own. This is a semi-quantitative tool that's used to compare one disease to another. On the good side, it's easy to change and really quite easy to understand. It requires very minimal upkeep in terms of complex IT requirements or anything like that. You just need to go in every season, but also ad hoc, changing where disease is present. But the disadvantage is that it's not automated, it's not on a web-based platform at all at the moment, and maybe it is too broadly defined, and we're concentrating too much on the high and medium risk pathways, and you can therefore miss out some of those lower risk ones. But that's all work that can be done on the tool. This is, as with any risk assessment process, it's a living document, so we can go back in and we can change it, particularly around things like the transport score. If countries in particular don't import much, but they export using a lot of livestock vehicles, then you might be wanting to consider more the transport coming back as having a bigger fomite risk than the exchange of animals itself. Now I'm just going to move to the actual tool itself to show you a little bit about what it is like. So bear with me please. So first of all, I showed you this particular part here, and we have the, I'll just put that back to 0, which is what it should be. And we have the country risk, and as you can see, these are the different regions where they have the global parts down here. These are areas that we do not have as trade partners, but you still need to score them because of that illegal score that comes into the tool. So if we look at the different spreadsheets you see here, the pathways, then we have the trade scores here for the different levels of all those consignments coming in. If it's a multiple species disease, then we count up the different species of animals that are imported, but you still get an overall score of as high as 3, but nothing greater than that. The mitigating action you can see here, and we have a final risk category that is translated into that, just a small bar chart really, and this is the sort of algorithm that I'm talking about at the top here. So to show you where it would work, I'm going to pick on African swine fever and say that disease is present in wild boar backyard herds in the western part or northwest of the EU. So I'll put that up to a 0.5 score. And if we go to the final risk category, you'll see that it jumps up immediately to still a low risk, but it's getting up towards that medium risk barrier. And if I change that score back to a 1, which meant that disease was present in commercial pigs, even though you've still got mitigating actions in place around the EU scores, then it does jump up to a medium risk, which is pretty much what you would expect for disease to be in such great proximity because of that transport risk and so on. If I take another disease, for example, West Nile fever, West Nile virus, then again, I'll just reset that. I was playing with it before. At the moment, the disease is down here. It's got a negligible risk of incursion into the UK. So what I'm going to do is say that we have disease present in horses in the northern EU. So we'll put that to 0.5 because let's say it's not in many of them. And if we move to that, then you'll see it's not changed. And you wouldn't expect it to. Horses are dead-end hosts for West Nile virus. It's a disease that's mainly carried through the reservoir, which is the wild bird, particularly corvids. So instead we'd want to change the score for the wild bird risk, which is on a separate page. So that's just to give you an idea of what this tool can do and how we can use it. I'll just quickly go back to our last slide here, which is to thank you all for joining us. For any further information, please write to ahaw@efsa.europa.eu. There will now be half an hour of Q&A for anybody who's interested. Please write your questions in and we'll try and answer them for you. But thank you.